Welcome to the third episode of Text for Nothing Conversations with Poets. My name is Antonio Ochoa, your host, and this evening we are honored to have Amanda Cook. She's visiting us from Gloucester. Before we start our conversation, I want to remind our viewers that you can go to our website, textfornothingtv.com, where you can find links to the poets' work. You can find links to readings. You can find links to other interviews, other conversations, and other types of material that you can sort of complement the conversation with. And without much further ado, welcome, Amanda. How are you?
I'm well, thank you for having me.
Well, thank you for coming. So I wanted to start with a little bit outside of the poetry world, in the world of making like tactile and like making of objects, because I know that you are very active in that. So I wanted to get started with something like that around that part of your life, your creative life.
Yeah, it's a big part of my creativity. I would say that making and writing and music and cooking and all the different parts of life sort of feed off each other in my life and in my world. My mother was a textile artist, and so I grew up always around fabric and around making things and about thinking in three dimensions and working with your hands. And so just to be a little bit different, I started my textile life more with yarn and knitting rather than with sewing, although I've do a fair amount of that also.
Mm-hmm. And so how do you start a project? Because do you see your projects as something that you do for your family, for yourself, or do you see them as art objects, or is there a difference?
There's a great combination.
Right.
Sometimes you knit something because you need it.
Right.
Sometimes you knit something because you imagine it. Sometimes you knit something because somebody else needs to feel loved.
Right.
And sometimes you just make something.
Right. Right. And so it depends on the...
It depends on why.
On why you're doing it.
And there are all different kinds of why. And sometimes it changes.
Right.
I've done everything from, knitting sweaters for all the babies that exist in my life to an art project a couple years ago where I embroidered a hoop skirt, an antique hoop skirt with all sorts of sayings. Everything on it were sayings from politicians, things they said about women.
Oh, wow.
And it was a really difficult thing to embroider. It took me hours and hours and
hours.
Of course. A couple months of embroidery.
Yeah.
And it was devastating to look at all the horrible things that politicians have said about women.
Yeah.
In the past few years.
Yeah. And what happened to where is that up somewhere or
That was for an art show that I co-curated in Gloucester with my friend Stevens Brosnahan. We were sitting around and there was a grant deadline approaching, and we thought, well, it's 10 o'clock, the deadline's not till midnight, let's write a grant.
Right.
So we wrote a grant and did a show on the art of resistance at the Rocky Neck Cultural Center in Gloucester.
Right.
And that was one of my pieces for that show.
Oh, wow. And it's still up, or is
it's down, it's in my studio.
Right.
It's made appearances at different events for women's rights.
Nice. So that's the other thing, you are very engaged with the community in different ways. Not only is your writing related to, or set rather, in Gloucester, but you also work at the Writer Center. You have different connections with the community. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Well, for Gloucester, I'm a relative newcomer. My grandfather went there in the 50s after getting his, becoming a pediatrician. And so my mother wasn't born there, which makes me a relative newcomer. Garrett Lansing and I always used to joke with each other because he lived there for probably 10 years longer than I did, but I was native. So my grandfather was the first pediatrician in town.
Oh, wow.
My father was a city councilor. My husband is now the principal at Gloucester High School. We imported him.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
I didn't know that.
And my stepmother was the city council president. My mother was an artist in town. And it's like a web.
Yeah.
So there are people, you can't really be anonymous or I can't be anonymous
Right,
in
right.
Gloucester.
But you were
But
telling,
it's-
and the good, I mean, talking about a web, you were telling me just before the show how the reception of your book uh, that's something that I haven't heard before. Like people outside the poetry world, like people of your community, were talking to you about it because they read your book.
Yeah, it's been a really interesting thing. You write a book of poetry and you expect it's not really going to be read
Right,
by
yeah.
a broad audience.
Yeah,
You expect people in the poetry world to read
Yeah.
it. And I would go into a shop and the shopkeeper would talk to me about my book. And my children's friends at the middle school were reading my book. And the preschool pathways where I go to work with poetry and children, the teacher there would say, "Oh, I've just read your book." And it's sort of a, I don't know that I imagined putting myself out that much because so much of it is autobiographical.
yeah.
I mean, everything that's about a person is autobiographical in there. I guess it's all autobiographical. But you don't imagine walking down the street and having a conversation about your book.
Right, especially a book where it is it's not only autobiographical, but it's there's some moments of bearing yourself as a very raw, emotional, personal, deep, putting your life, basically the fabric of your life,
Yeah.
to use that metaphor, like for the reader to have there.
Yeah, it's definitely been. It's a weird thing to say about your own book, but it's been meaningful to a lot of people because so many people around our ages are dealing with their parents.
Right.
And for a lot of people to be able to read somebody else dealing with their parents on a daily basis. Relatively early in the book, my father dies, and then we follow my mother as she sinks into dementia. And for people to see that and read it, it helps them not feel alone in it.
Right. No, and I as I was saying, I can totally identify myself or relate to that rather because my father also died of a pulmonary disease, and my mother had dementia. So that as I didn't know that was a part of the book, and when I was reading it, I was like, oh my God, this is
Yeah.
insane.
And I've had a lot of women, a lot of mothers,
Right.
who are thankful for being able to acknowledge the beauty in their daily lives of raising children,
Of course.
which, I mean, it's one of the most beautiful things if you're able to do it.
Yeah.
But it's really exhausting and really kind of boring and plain at the same time. So sometimes all you do have is the way the light shines in the window on a bowl of oranges, or
Right.
I mean, that's really the moment where you have to look and say, okay, nobody's crying, it's beautiful right now, this is great.
Right, right, and that comes like that's absolutely well. That in the book is so well reflected. You have that, for example, that moment that you just described, and then you have a sentence later or an image later is something completely different, and it has to do with your mother, or has to do with your garden, or it has to do with politics, which is not a lot, but there's a few things that compose the your daily life.
Yeah.
Which is one of the wonderful things about this reading this book is that idea or that reality that we're seeing. And I really enjoyed it.
Yeah, well, thank you for that. It was necessary to write.
Right. So how was your process when you were writing? Like, because the book interestingly started as a blog.
Yeah.
And then tell us a little bit about that, because that's such an interesting sort of. You had no intention of making it into a book
I
at
had
the
no
beginning.
intention of making it a book, and it was just about all written as a blog, all but the very last bit. And it started when blogs were all the rage.
Right.
It was everybody had a blog, and it was sort of our way of communicating with each other across the poetry world. And so you would write your blog, and it would be like writing an open letter to friends.
Right.
And sometimes, so I would continue to write, and sometimes I had one person in mind when I was writing. Sometimes I had more than one person. Sometimes it was a general you I was writing to. It's not a consistent you. And then as life got more complicated, it would be the only time I would really have to myself and in my own head. I started going out when my daughter, who's now 14, was a baby, I started going out with a friend to the bar that was equidistant from our houses. And we'd put our babies to sleep,
Yeah.
and we would walk to the bar and sit there in the corner in the dark listening to loud music. There was an open jam that happened, and all these musicians would get up, and you'd become friends with all the musicians, and we would listen to loud music, drink more than was probably appropriate, and stumble home and get home at 1 o'clock in the morning or 1:30 and be alone.
Right.
So a lot of it was written in those moments when it's like I've cleared my head, here I am alone.
Right.
So a lot of it was written very late on Monday nights or Tuesday mornings.
Right.
And so the process was, when I had something to write, I'd write it.
Right.
And as the book progresses through the years, there are fewer and fewer times that I write something, but I found that those things that I wrote became really useful documentation for me.
Yeah.
Sometimes I'd go back and I think, did this happen?
Right.
This story is too crazy. I was thinking on the way up about magical thinking and magical realism and how real life is. But
Right.
how life is a bit of magical realism, because there are all these crazy things that happen to you, and if you notice them, they are magic.
Right.
But especially when you're dealing with somebody with dementia, you have or young children, you have a lot of magic around you. And it was really easy. It's really easy to question yourself about what's happened in your own life. So
Right.
writing it really helped me document in some ways what was happening in my life. And looking back at it, I have a fuller story that if I hadn't written them down.
Right. No. Yeah, like a record. Like you're
Yeah.
keeping a record of the different, and that's one of the things that I found beautiful in reading the book was exactly that, a movement between different aspects of your life. Within one image, within one paragraph, you have references to cooking your garden, then your children or one of your children crying, and then you're talking about a politician, then you're talking about, and it's not you're moving really fast between different things throughout the book.
That's kind of the way life goes.
Right,
Where you
exactly.
have to just react.
That's the way it feels when you're reading
Yeah.
it. Like that's the way it feels.
And I also find that some of those stories, when you write them down, you don't have the burden anymore of carrying them.
Right. Right.
And that's a nice thing
Right.
to relieve yourself of the burden.
And so how did you because you said your mother was a textile artist. So how did you move into poetry?
My mother was a voracious reader, and my whole family on my mother's side was filled with people who continued to learn on their own.
Right.
My grandfather studied art and jazz. Even though he was a pediatrician, he was constantly reading, at least until he fell asleep with a book on his face.
Right.
And my mother would pick a subject every year and study it.
Oh wow.
So she would study an artist or a writer or dinosaurs or Fibonacci sequence
Right.
and study it for a year, read all the books she could find about it. And so reading and learning and writing were always part of our lives. And we were pretty impoverished in our childhood. And there's a great line, I can't remember where I read it, but I stole it. It's not mine. I want no credit for it.
Yeah.
But about the poverty of the handmaid.
Right.
I don't know
Yeah.
where it's from anymore.
Yeah.
But it's true, that idea that in making a life, also being divorced, a divorced woman in the 80s,
Right.
you are sort of impoverished. So the thing we had was books.
Right.
And I grew up with Shakespeare and Jane Austen and William Carlos Williams at kid level.
Right.
So those are the books that I just read, and way too much Isaac Bashevis Singer for any young person to read.
Right.
So I read a lot of books when I was young, and I think I read enough iambic pentameter that I could probably speak in it if I tried.
Wow.
But
Right.
and also listening to music, listening to jazz, and keeping the beat when the music goes off course, and so being surrounded by music and jazz, and then my mother's artwork, her patchwork. She was really good at traditional patchwork, but then she started working in silk, which gives you more flexibility than working in cotton. And so she would say, take Fibonacci sequence and make it in silk. So
Right.
she'd do it the center of a sunflower in patchwork.
Oh. Mhm.
And so looking at patterns, looking at the way things go together and the beauty of it kind of filter into everything.
Right. Well, I can sort of see the patterns in textiles and the patterns in music and the patterns in poetry. That's something that to me is essential in terms of
Yeah.
that creation. And did you study like anything, let's say around like go to art school, or how did you just?
No, I've dropped out of college 3 times so far.
Okay.
I started at Emerson studying writing,
Yeah.
where I met my husband, James Cook, and I ran out of money.
Right.
So I went to Leslie, which was half the price, but I
Right.
ran out of money. Then I went to Salem State. And by that point, I was much more practical and I was thinking about education, but we couldn't afford for both of us to go to school at the same time and pay rent. So
Right.
he got his master's. And knowing that staying home with the kids was really important to me,
Yeah.
I put it off.
Of course.
I might go back.
Right. You know,
But-
absolutely. But that is like that is such a reality of this country where people are not being able to afford education anymore and have to make those
Yeah.
decisions. The cost of education is through the roof, and the actual practical value of an English degree or a writing degree sometimes is not necessarily the job market doesn't have.
Right, and
room
well,
for
this is the
people.
thing about Gloucester too, is that I started working soon after leaving college for Gregor Gibson at 10 Pound Island Book Company as a rare maritime book dealer, and from there ended up, not directly from there, but it was through my involvement in that world and also just the webs of Gloucester, ending up at the Gloucester Writers Center,
Right. Which is where you work
which
right
is
now.
where I am now.
Right. And tell us a little bit about your present position there. What are some of the activities that you do there?
I lead a bunch of writing groups. I lead a group for women of limited means, a writing group which is full of it sort of changes it transitions from one thing to the next, but the next writing group currently has a bunch of young musicians in it writing songs and
Nice.
poetry. And I work in a local daycare. I go in and do poetry with kids, the preschoolers, every week. I run events, the website,
Right.
the practical part of
Of
doing
the center.
of
Yeah.
the center. And
Is there any events coming up? Like anything
Oh.
that you're wanna like advertise right now?
I would say we have a lot coming up, and you should go to gloucesterwriters.org
Good.
to see all the events coming up. And also, we have the Maud Olson Library, which is now open on Tuesdays and Thursdays. This is a library that Ralph Maud constructed to replicate Charles Olson's library, and he went to stores and made all the notations that are in Olson's books in the books that he bought.
Oh wow.
And so we have Charles Olson's table,
Mhm.
and you can sit at Charles Olson's table and surround yourself with the books that he
That he had.
had with his notations in them, and it's
Oh wow.
a really intense experience.
That's very cool.
Yeah.
Yeah. So you brought a little bit of work.
Yeah.
So tell us a little bit about what you brought.
Well, these are some yarns that I've dyed, and then this is a current project that I'm working on with my studio mate Camilla McFadden and our friend Stevens Brosnahan. I don't know, can you see this? It probably doesn't show up so well there. You can
Right.
see a little bit of an outline, but this is embroidery on, this is hand-dyed silk that Camilla dyed, and she printed it with plates that she's made out of dried local seaweed. And so these marks here are all
Oh, I
the
see.
imprint of seaweed, mostly
Ah.
rockweed for this. And embroidered on it is a mussel. We are working on a project based on the work of Ernst Haeckel, looking at microorganisms in the water and embroidering them on a large scale so you can see the beautiful shapes of diatoms and things like that.
And that is gonna be for like what is the project is gonna be an exhibition? Is gonna be part of a
Are going to exhibit it, and it'll probably be in a local biotech in the long
cool.
run.
Yeah.
Or it might be, but the idea is that it can move. We're going to have 4 panels of different ecosystems around Cape Ann. We're doing the inner harbor, the salt marsh, the open water, and inside.
Oh, cool.
What's our 4th one? Maybe the sandy shore.
Right, right,
and
right.
Exploring. Stevens is taking samples and drawing from the samples, using a microscope, drawing from the samples what exists in each of these areas. And so each large panel will have a selection of creatures.
Nice.
It's, yeah, just a little embroidery
Yeah.
on 4 9-foot panels.
Do you have a favorite type of fabric that you like to work with?
It really changes based on what you want to do.
Right.
For experimental patchwork, I've been dyeing silk, raw silk, not a sheer silk, but sort of raw nubby silk, and I love using that because you can make curves and shapes and angles in it that are really hard to do, that don't lie, so because the fabric has much more give to it than a cotton fabric.
Oh.
I dye this yarn that's a really bulky, thick yarn that I love to knit hats. It's just so pleasing. Like
Yeah.
it feels good.
Yeah.
And this yarn here that I've been embroidering with is a silk and wool. That's really, I love the way different textiles take color differently.
Right.
So this little bit of silk in this wool gives it a sheen that's really lovely. So for this, I dyed this color to embroider the mussel. So
So you do that. You even because I don't know very much about this. So you buy the yarn,
yeah,
which is basically will be like raw.
it's it'll just be like this but plain white.
Okay.
I mean, I do spin also, but I'm not spinning for this project.
Oh, you do spin too.
Yeah, I do spin too, but not
Okay.
for this.
Okay.
So I know, why not start right at the beginning?
Right. That's that. Yeah. Absolutely.
So you have an idea, and then you figure out how the materials suit the idea, and then what can you do to make the materials right
Right.
for
Right.
the
Right.
for the project.
And you basically go from the sometimes spinning your own
Yeah.
threads and yarns,
Yeah.
or you go buy the
like a plain
a
skein
plain
of-
one and then you dye them.
Yeah.
And so how does that work? What do you buy the color? Like, I don't know anything about that, so I'm
I use,
kind of interested in
acid-based dyes, which
Yeah.
are a little, when you're mixing the dyes, when they're in powdered form, they're a little dangerous, but not so dangerous. I would love to get into natural dyeing, but
Right.
the mordants that you need are a little bit stronger. When I'm done dyeing this, there's no byproduct. All I have left is clear water, because if you do it properly, the wool or the silk absorbs all the dye.
Right.
So I have no byproduct, which
Oh, okay.
feels good to not have
Of
anything
course.
wasted.
Yeah.
But so I use those, which means I have to use a protein-based textile like wool or silk, not a cotton.
Huh.
And
That's fascinating.
it's
It's
this is all the
fascinating.
stuff.
Yeah, I remember my grandmother and my aunt talking about yarn and like
Mm-hmm.
looking at yarn and going to buy and knitting and all that stuff.
Yeah.
And so it's a really interesting world that I'm not really familiar with. And then like in the poetry, and that's something that I wanted to ask you when I was reading your book and I was working for tonight, I was came up with Annie Albert's book on weaving. I've always, when I think of weaving or patterns in fabrics, I think of Duncan, because he worked so much with that idea of the poetry or the world being like the different patterns or the different layers of. So do you have a because my question would be like, do you have like a theoretical angle? Do you think about it in that way, or do you basically just more like make the things without thinking about
I
it?
don't think I have a theoretical plan about it,
Yeah.
but what you get used to is the way tension works, and the way twist works,
Oh.
and the way contrast works, and how important balance is, and what empty space means to design,
Right.
And all of these things, I mean, you think about a way a poem looks like jazz or feels like jazz, and what makes it feel like jazz. It's about the points. It's about staying close to the plot, but not staying on the plot. It's about
Right.
the space in it, and it's so that sort of stuff. I would say that all of it informs, like one thing informs the other, rather
Right.
than one thing lends its theory.
Right. Yeah. That. Okay. I thought I lost my train of thought. Yes. And I just said that I was prepared for this.
No, you are. You're very prepared. I mean, you brought up Albers. I've been watching. I have just come off of having a broken finger, which kept me from a lot of this. And one thing I did while I was broken was watch Craft in America,
Right.
and there was the episode on Black Mountain was great
Right.
for showing her work.
Oh,
and
that's what I was gonna. That was thinking when you mentioned tension. One of the parts that I read that the Albers book talks about like a traditional Latin American weaving or weaver that they tie their part of
Right,
it to their
right.
waist, which I've seen since I'm from Mexico. I've seen that since I
Yeah.
don't remember when was the first time, but it's a traditional sort of way of weaving. And what she talked about, something I never thought about, is about tension and
That's
how
huge.
the person can actually release or increase the tension according to the position of their back. That was just like
Yeah, no, your whole body influences what you're doing. And
Right.
for many knitters, for instance, their problem comes with tension and with whether they can keep a tension or keep things loose, or whether their color work is too tight or this or that.
right. And I never had I have never
No,
imagined
tension
that
is
was
huge.
that was which is also like the poem.
Yeah.
Like you have to maintain
Yeah.
that tension between sounds, between images, between ideas.
Yeah.